Awesome. This call will now be recorded. Thanks everyone for joining and welcome to our session today where we will be reviewing ALM Made Easy with pipelines in managed environments. Our presenters today are the talented Tim Hanowich and Doug Bell, technology specialists serving our state and local government customers. We also have a couple folks monitoring the chat today to get all of your questions answered throughout the session. We aim to provide a digital event that respects all individuals. We ask that everyone assist in providing a welcoming and safe environment. We do bring 3 of these events to our customers every month, 3 Thursdays a month at 2 p.m. Eastern. If there's a topic that you would like to hear about in the future, please post that in the chat now for consideration. To minimize distractions or potential background noise today, we are going to leverage the chat for questions. Please post your questions in the chat and we'll get those answered for you. We also send follow-ups via email. If you don't want to be included in the follow-ups in the future, please reply and we will take you off the distribution list. As always, we'll drop a few poll questions during the session today to get some insight. They are all anonymous. So let's go ahead and get started. Tim, Doug, I'm going to pass it over to you to take it away here.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly, and well said on the intro. So thank you all for coming today. Today, Doug and I have a very cool session planned out on a very cool topic. Quickly, today's agenda. We'll first cover the very basic fundamentals of ALM. We'll then talk about how you can incorporate ALM practices into the Power Platform. And then finally, Doug will give a very cool demo on pipelines, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So to start today, so far in the series, I think we've had now almost 12 months worth of series. We've talked a lot about the actual software development process, right? How to make a mobile app with a Canvas app and Power Apps, how to make a cloud-based workflow with Power Automate, or how to make a virtual bot with Power Virtual Agents, or PVA for short, right? And that's been fantastic. But what we have not spent much time on, so far at least, has been the entire peripheral process around that development, right? And many people might not know, but there's actually an entire process that people spend entire careers on. And that process is called Application Lifecycle Management, or ALM for short. And now, if you're coming from a background of maybe, professional IT, maybe DevOps, for example, you probably know what ALM is. But if you don't, totally fine. We'll review right now very quickly. So ALM is essentially a process that contains multiple stages. And the first stage in ALM is known as the plan and track phase. In this stage, you define your software objectives, your requirements, you create a plan, and that plan will contain, milestones and timelines, and you'll assign individual tasks to developers to then put into creation, essentially. You would then move from that phase to the develop phase. And that's when you would put pen on paper. You would use tools such as, Power Apps, Power Automate, PVA, Dataverse to actually create your software that you had planned and outlined in the plan and track phase. And in this phase, you would build everything from the database structure, tables, option sets, UI, workloads, and so forth. After development, you would then move to the build and test phase. And for us here in Power Platform, the word build may not apply because, of course, we do not actually compile code in Power Apps. So more so, you'd be testing here. You would perform unit tests, integration tests, system tests, and your goal there would be to identify proactively any problems with the code that you wrote before, or any bugs that might exist there. After you say, okay, my app works as I hoped it would, you then are now prepared to move on to the deploy phase. And in this phase, you would lift your application out of building, out of testing, and you would move it into where it will live long-term, into a production type environment. And there it would live forever, and it would serve your intended customers. Finally, after deployment, you're now in the operate phase. And this is where your app does what it's designed to do, serve your customers, your constituents. And if you're in IT at this phase, you probably will spend most of your time ensuring that people can use the app properly as you had intended for them to do so. And then finally, after the operate phase, we have our last phase. That is the monitor phase. And in this phase, you would continuously monitor the usage of your app, health, performance. You may collect things like statistical metrics and logs to know how people use your app better. And you would do all this with the intention of using it to plan for a future iteration of your software. So you would use what you learn here to incorporate into the plan for version 2 or 3 or 4, for example. And this is called ALM. It's a life cycle. And this is designed to help you take your software idea all the way from its ideation phase, infancy, to its grave. So this should continue throughout the entire life cycle of the application. And thus, it's not linear as I have it here. It's actually more of a circular type approach to it. So it's a cycle, if you will. And again, this happens each time. So each cycle is a different iteration, different version. And today, we'll spend most of our time on the deploy phase. So moving on here, how do we apply ALM practices, that process you saw before, to Power Platform? And before we talk about that, let's first discuss and refresh on 2 core concepts that are required and necessary to be able to use ALM in the platform. And the first one are called environments, right? And these environments, think of these as essentially completely independently, separately partitioned databases. They contain everything from your apps, your tables, users, workflows, and so forth. And everything in an environment is designed to be completely self-contained. In other words, an app in environment A should never rely on and can't rely on a table or a workflow or another resource in environment B, for example. So they're meant to be entirely self-contained and self-independent. There are several different types of environments. The first one we probably hear of most often is called production. And production is meant to be the home of any permanent solution designed to be customer serving. So anything that you depend on, it's very important to you, should live in a production environment. We also have what's called a sandbox environment. Technically, this environment functions the same as production, right? It performs the same way. Only difference here is it has a copy button and a reset button. And these 2 features allow you to, first of all, copy an environment and also reset an environment, or in other words, wipe it out entirely. So for that reason, this is designed to be used for test purposes typically, or development purposes. And then finally, we have the trial environment, which is designed to be used for only short-term test type scenarios. The platform permits you to have 1 trial environment per person, and every environment that's a trial environment will expire after 1 month. So simply use these for your simple, quick, short-term type tests. Now, finally, there's one more concept here known as managed environments. This is not meant to be, it's not an entirely separate environment type, but rather a feature that you would enable in an environment that provides you with different functionality. And that functionality I have here. So for example, once you enable this functionality in your environment, it allows you as an admin to have better insights into usage, who makes what, who the most active people, for example, are. Also, a weekly admin digest, data policy views, um, more control over the sharing and limitation of sharing of certain apps. And more importantly for today, it allows you also to use what are known as Power Platform pipelines coming later on. So those are environments. The other topic we should discuss first is solutions. So Your tenant has multiple environments inside of it. In each environment are multiple solutions. Think of a solution in an environment as simply a package of resources that pertain to a certain use case. So for example, I have maybe solution for, time off requests, injury reporting, and so forth. Um, you would use these for one of three reasons. The first one would be simply for organization, right? Keep things separate, which is fantastic. Next, you would use these possibly for the reason to archive your solution. So maybe you spent time developing your own app or workflow and you wanted to save it locally so that in the future, as a backup, you could put it there, export it, and save it locally in your PC as a zip file. And finally, you might use these to accomplish and to manage the process of exporting from one environment and importing into another. And that is today's kind of purpose, today's topic is that process right there. And again, to put it here visually, a solution is nothing more than a collection of resources. So each solution can contain multiple applications, chatbots, choices, workflows, tables, and so forth. So finally, how do we use environments and solutions in the ALM process in the platform? How is that achieved right now, at least? So traditionally, what happens is when it comes time to develop a piece of software, usually developers, either one of them, 2, 3, 5, 20 developers will make that application in what's known as a development environment. This is an environment that is exclusively designed, intentionally designed to only serve one purpose. That's to host development of an application or a workflow, for example. After they say that we're done now, the app does what we wanted to do, they want to test it, they would then export that solution to a zip file and import it into a testing environment. And this environment is again an environment meant only to be used for testing purposes. And here, developers and or people from the business, the customers, will test the application on fake data and fake users. Finally, after it's completed, they would then move it permanently to a production database where again, it would live long term. It would live there, serve customers, and it would be used by the business, right? Your intended audience on real data with real people in real use cases. Now, this is the typical way that we see that, development, build, test, deploy type operation happening in ALM in our Power Platform. And today's topic will actually be focused on this part of it, the actual migration and movement of solutions in between environments from development to testing to production. And so right now, traditionally, that's a manual process. So you would manually export the solution from an environment and import it to the new one. Now we have a solution available to do it for you automatically. And we call those Power Platform pipelines. And this is a way to set up what's called a pipeline to pipe essentially your solution from, for example, development to testing to production. And more importantly, it's available now in both commercial and in GCC. So Doug, over to you for a demo.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tim. Much appreciate the lead in as always. It looks like we got a little over eager with our poll questions. It looks like all three came out at once, but we were trying to get a little bit of an understanding of where you all are at currently from an ALM perspective and how well that's working for you. So I'm just looking at the results here. It looks like our polls are now closed. But a majority of folks, probably as we would have anticipated, are just doing manual export and import of solutions. That's the easiest way to go about it historically. It's simple. There's really no kind of entry cost, if you will, to manually exporting and importing. But it's not necessarily the most sustainable. Now, quite a few folks actually impressively are using some kind of a pro dev pipeline currently, like Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions. perhaps with some level of automation involved, and that's fantastic, right? Like that's obviously a more advanced way of managing ALM processes. And for many more complex solutions, there's additional benefits to using those approaches. So pipelines does not necessarily render those kinds of approaches obsolete. But what pipelines will do, among other things, is it will make sound ALM procedures accessible to more makers. Right? Like we often get the question where we have, citizen developers or business makers, and we're thinking, what kind of ALM is appropriate for them? Should they just be developing in production? Maybe sometimes that's okay. But one of the major benefits that pipelines offer is kind of that middle ground, somewhere in between having no ALM and fully automated pro dev ALM. Pipelines offer us a nice option for that middle ground in particular, and oftentimes even for professional developers, in scenarios that don't merit full-scale ALM procedures, pipelines will just be an easier, lower cost of entry, if you will, way to manage your ALM pipelines. So moving on to our second poll question, it looks like there's a number of folks with room for improvement. The majority of responses said, how well is our current ALM and deployment process working? It's like, well, it's not the easiest, but it works. And then our third question was kind of premature, so I'll disregard that one for the time being. But the hope is that if you haven't explored pipelines yet, coming out of this session, you will be inspired to investigate further and figure out if and where it might be appropriate for you. But Tim, since I don't have a poll question, and since you and I don't think have ever done one of these tech series together, I have a very important question for you. Would you rather fight a horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses?
This was not prepared, Doug. I
It
didn't
was
see
not?
it coming. So
It was not.
I would definitely rather fight probably a horse-sized duck, I'm thinking.
Really? Look at the beak on that thing, man. How are you going to take that down?
I don't know.
All right, I think I'd try my luck with the 100 duck-sized horses. At least they're smaller. That giant thing coming out of the sky at me, no thanks. All right, I digress. Tim promised you a demo, so let's get there next. So there was a good question, and Tim clarified this. We clarified it in the chat. But managed environments and pipelines are now available in GCC. Managed environments have been there for a couple months, I think. Pipelines is relatively new to GCC. We've been seeing kind of the components arrive for the last couple months now. But as of a few weeks ago, pipelines is fully functional and operational in GCC. And so our timing for this session, frankly, is not an accident. And the demo I'm going to do for you all today will be in a government community cloud tenant. As much as possible, I try to do that. I know the majority, not all, but a majority of our audience here on this tech series is operating in the government community cloud. And I like to share experiences that will be synonymous with what you all actually experience in your own environment. So today, all of our demo will be in the government community cloud. So I'm logged into GCC here. I'm in my development environment. It's called my Doug Bell workspace. And the beauty of pipelines is the simplicity here. So a simple demo of pipelines, there's really not much to it. Unfortunately, we do have a couple other scenarios teed up for you all today. But this first demo, this first little scenario here, this happy path, it's very, very simple. So I have a collection of solutions in my environment here. I'm going to work off of this mini RMTS solution. And traditionally, if I were doing an export import, right, I'd come to my list of solutions and I'd say I want to export it, and I go through that process. I select whether I want a managed or an unmanaged solution. I would download the zip file. I'd go to my target environment and I'd import it, right? Like that's the traditional process, assuming that I'm not using some kind of Azure DevOps or GitHub automation. That process works okay. There's more manual steps to conduct, obviously. There's also more potential for error. There's more potential for things to go wrong, to grab the wrong file, like who knows, right? The more steps I have to do manually as a human, the more potential for error inherently exists. So that's not the direction we're going to go. We're actually going to enter into this solution. And now with pipelines available in GCC and configured for this environment, I'll circle back and give you a couple little tips and tricks and insight on configuration. But with with pipelines configured for this environment and my development environment defined as a development environment within our pipelines configuration, I now have this navigation element within solutions that allows me to access my pipelines. So this is my main pipeline here, right? From my development environment, I can go to test, then I can go to production. It's worth noting that I can have multiple pipelines, right? Like if I do work in my development environment and sometimes it goes in this direction and sometimes it goes in that direction, I can have multiple pipelines defined for a particular environment. So it's worth noting if that scenario applies to you. But once I come here, the process of deploying this pipeline is pretty simple. I'm going to pick deploy now. It's going to go to test. That's the first step, or the second step, I guess, in my pipeline. Once I've done my work in my development environment, I'm going to click next. At this point, it's actually running our solution checker here. And I believe I have all the required artifacts as part of this solution. We'll keep this first scenario nice and simple, but it's doing some checks here. It is trying to protect me from myself a little bit to some degree. Sometimes, depending on my connection references, if you're familiar with that concept, when we use various connectors within Canvas apps, when we use connectors within Power Automate Cloud Flows, we'll have connection references which define what credentials or what API keys, et cetera, we're using to connect to various services. So sometimes when depending on what I have in the solution, sometimes it'll ask me to sign into those connections or give me the opportunity to pick a different account for some of those connections if that's appropriate when I'm moving from one environment to another. So all of that kind of consideration is going on right now as I'm starting this process to deploy my pipelines. And you can see here, I have one of these, right? I have a connection to Dataverse here. It's just checking. It was able to successfully sign me in automatically. I've already gone through the solution checker point. So the fact that I didn't get any errors inherently tells me that my solution is sound. I'm not missing any required artifacts. And I'll just click next. There's nothing for me to do. If I wanted to change my connection, right, like I'm just using my primary credentials here to deploy this to my test environment. But if I wanted to use a service account or a different credentials to make this Dataverse connection or to make a SharePoint connection or something like that, I do have the opportunity here as I'm deploying this solution to change those connections. So that's a little different than if I was doing a manual import. We're kind of doing that on the front end now rather than doing that on the back end as I'm importing that solution. And I'll just move to the next. If I want to make any notes or anything like that, I can go for it. And then I'll just click deploy. And so what this is going to do in the back end is it's still going to export this solution. So first thing it's going to do is export that solution into a traditional zip file. When I'm using pipelines, I'm always going to be using a managed solution. So we'll touch on that a little bit more. But this is always going to be a managed solution. It's going to export that, and that artifact will be fixed. So if for some reason, if I do more development and I change some more things before I deploy to prod, the artifact that I'm deploying right now is the same artifact that will be deployed to prod as this particular solution. And this version of the solution continues through this pipeline. So we're kind of memorializing the artifact that's being deployed right now. So the first step is that export of the artifact of the solution file itself, and then it'll get deployed to prod. So this will take a couple minutes. I'll probably transition to my next scenario while this is working, and then we'll circle back. But Professor Tim, I have a question for you. All right, I'm a developer. I was working on this solution, and to do basic unit testing and whatnot, like I jammed a bunch of junky test data into my development environment. Like, is all that junky data coming with me when I deploy the solution?
Yeah, great question, Doug. It will not, because this moves only artifacts over, not data. So any data that you have in testing should live there, production should live there. It will not move data over with it. Good question.
All right, good. That's reassuring. When I was doing traditional ALM, that was always the case. I wasn't sure if this was kind of changing the paradigm on data. So anyways, that's good to know. I'm going to let this run, and I'm going to work on another solution as well. And I think this solution is missing some required artifacts. So I just want to give us a taste of what that looks like. So while that pipeline is running, I'm going to go to my fish passage inspection solution here. And this is This one's a little more involved, right? I have a variety of tables. I have some choice fields. I have Canvas apps. I have model-driven apps. I have a number of connection references. Like I've got a lot of artifacts in this solution. And turns out I actually wasn't all that diligent about making sure that I was doing all of my development work within the context of the solution. So I'm going to go run this pipeline again. I'm going to run the same pipeline here. And once this pulls up, and as we go, once I start through this deployment here, I might get some errors. All right, this is a bigger solution. I've got a lot of moving parts. And I just want to make sure that my solution checker is doing its thing and it's going to surface any missing required artifacts. Yeah, sure enough, my initial validation failed due to missing dependencies here. And so a lot of times, yeah, I know we have our solution checker, but you know, as a business maker, as a citizen developer, I'm not always diligent about making sure that when I export a solution that I'm running the solution checker, that I'm checking for any missing dependencies or anything like that. So another thing that's really nice about pipelines is that it's going to do that inherently for me. And again, kind of reducing the potential points of failure here. So I'm getting proactively. I've got some missing dependencies, and I have a couple. It looks like I'm actually missing two components. I'm missing this choice. I have a choice field here, and I don't have the backing choice for it. And then I have a connection reference that got missed somehow that's required by a couple of flows. So the easiest way to do this, for me at least, the easiest way to mitigate these missing dependencies here is to figure out and make a note of which objects require this component, right? Like I could remember which component it is and I could go back to my solution and I could pull it in. For me, what's easier is to say, all right, so I got this, this passage inspection table that needs a choice field column. And then I have a couple of these Power Automate flows. So mitigation required post to teams. That's what I'm going to try to remember. So can't actually execute this pipeline yet. I've got some issues with my solution that I need to mitigate first. So I'm going to close out here. I'm going to discard that pipeline run. I'm going to go back to my solution itself. I guess I should go to the objects in my solution. I'm going to look for the tables, right? I have this passage inspection table. If you're not aware of this little tool, this is also very handy. If I select an object in a solution and I can go to the advanced tab here, I can say I'm going to add all the objects that are required by that, right? So this is why I looked at, more so than looking at which components I was missing. I just wanted to find out, which components have a dependency that's missing. So I went to that table. All right, so it added some required objects for me. Now I'm going to go to my cloud flows and do the same kind of thing. It was this cloud flow that had a missing required object. So I'm going to add those required objects here. And I think I have another choice field in here now. I have another connection reference. So if I've done my job correctly, next time I run this pipeline, I should move successfully past that validation and get to the point where I'm actually able to execute this pipeline. So I just think that's handy. It's certainly handy for me as someone who's not a professional developer, that's not accustomed to, that's not diligent about ensuring that I have full integrity of my solution here. The fact that these pipelines are automatically triggering that solution checker for me and identifying any missing dependencies and required objects in there. So anyways, I'm not going to move this one fully through the process, but this is the same kind of point here where I can, I'm going to establish a bunch of new connections in my target environment. So I need to make sure that my connection references are all in place. For something like Bing Maps, right? This is a connection that depends on an API key. So if I click create here, I'd have to provide an API key. It's a little different than like our Azure AD based authentication for most of our connectors. So anyways, I have full control as I'm executing these pipelines to determine what the connection to these other services are going to be in my target environments. Which actually begs another question, Tim. I'm running the solution checker here. So that makes sure that when I'm moving from my development environment to my test or my production environment, that everything is in place and is intact. But once my solution and all my apps and other artifacts, et cetera, go into that target environment, like what ensures the integrity of what I've created in my target environment?
Yeah, you'll see, Doug, that when you export solutions now, there should be a solution checker feature available. And that will, maybe some people here are familiar with trying to import a solution that's not complete. It'll tell you that when you import it. Now, before you export solution, that will also happen. So during the actual pipeline process, moving from environment A to environment B, it should tell you about those errors and those missing dependencies.
That's good. But what about, how do I make sure that nobody's doing development in test or prod, right? Like I move my app there. Like, could somebody just go edit it then?
Good question. So before we mention solutions, I should elaborate here a little further. There are two types of solutions, managed and unmanaged. Unmanaged means that the solution is open, developers can go in and they can change parts of it. Managed means that it's closed, people can only use the apps from it. Every solution deployed by pipelines is by default a managed solution. So that ensures that development happens in the development environment. Once it arrives in production, it's then closed off and meant to be used only, not changed in any way.
Cool. And so I didn't get that choice, right? Like I'm accustomed to when I export a solution, I get that choice. Do I want to do a managed or an unmanaged solution? So if I'm thinking about this correctly, like that's another example of how pipelines is kind of forcing me into more sound and more reliable ALM processes, right? Like it's not forcing, it's automatically running that solution checker for me. It's inherently moving my solution as a managed solution rather than me accidentally doing it as an unmanaged solution. So is it fair to say that like by using pipelines, it's helping to ensure more sound ALM procedures?
Absolutely. That's correct. So that's fair.
All right, good. I just want to make sure I'm not overselling these things. You got to keep me honest. All right. So let's go back and check out our first one here. I think I ran this mini RMTS and it was moving through my pipeline here, and it got deployed into this environment 5 minutes ago. And I think I'd actually meant to go to this target environment and show you, hey, there's nothing up my sleeve. This was a brand new environment that I just deployed the other day. There was nothing in here before I ran this pipeline. But now if I go to this environment, you'll just have to take my word for it. There was nothing in here before. I come down and look, and I have an app, right? This RMTS response app. It was just installed. It was modified 6 minutes ago. So that was by my pipeline, right? I'm in my target environment now. I'm seeing part of my solution show up. One piece of it is an app. And perhaps the most evident proof is if I go to my list of solutions. I now have this mini RMTS solution in here. It was created 7 minutes ago. I open this solution up. It has all the same artifacts. These will be managed, right? That's the conversation we were just having. These are all now managed artifacts rather than unmanaged artifacts that can continue to be modified. I can see up here, we're confirming what Professor Tim told me, which is that I cannot directly edit the objects within a managed solution. And this is ready to go, right? Like none of my junky test data came with me. So if I need to set up some more data or anything like that, I would need to do so, or have a separate procedure for moving that data. But my app is installed. This is just a simple little Canvas app. My app is installed in this environment. It's ready to go. I've got this experience. I can use this app, right? So, once these artifacts get installed in the target environment, they're fully available and ready to run. Okay, so that's a little bit about pipelines in action, right? Like we started with the happy path, and it's super simple, right? I'm trying to turn this into some more meaningful content, but if we were just running a pipeline, it'd be about 3 clicks and off it goes. Magically shows up in my target environment. I mean, you could see how it's making this ALM procedure so much easier and kind of hitting this target middle ground where we were kind of historically missing an automated process that was somewhere in between manually moving solutions and doing full-on pro dev ALM automation with Azure DevOps or GitHub. Just hits this sweet spot and makes my life as a citizen developer certainly so much easier. But how did I set that up, right? And this is some of the important part here. First things first is we have to get the Power Apps pipeline function installed in a in a host environment, right? So if I think about the architecture here, obviously I have my development environment, I have my test and my production environments, right? Like I have all the typical environments that I would think about when I'm plotting my environment strategy and thinking about what my ALM approaches are going to be. The other thing I need is a host environment for the Power Apps pipeline function itself. In my environment, in our GCC tenant, we have the Center of Excellence toolkit set up. That's where, as administrators, we monitor, manage, and govern everything that's occurring in the platform. To me, that's a very logical place. If you have a center of excellence environment set up, to me, that seems like a very logical environment to use as my host for Power Platform pipelines. If you don't have a COE set up, it probably makes sense to create a new dedicated environment for hosting Power Platform pipelines. While nothing prohibits you from using a traditional production environment or test environment to host the pipelines function, it's probably not advised. It makes sense to have a dedicated environment, whether that's an existing environment that has a COE, an existing environment that you use for some other kind of admin activities, or a net new environment. You probably want to pick a specific environment for hosting and configuring these pipelines. Once you've identified that environment, I'm going to go to my Power Platform Admin Center. I'm going to pick that environment, right? I'll just pick any old environment here. I'm going to open that environment up to install the pipeline solution itself. I'm going to go to Resources at the top. I'm going to go to my Dynamics 365 apps. I'm going to say I want to install an app at the top, and I'm going to scroll down here to find Power Platform Pipelines. There it is. This should be available in all our GCC tenants. And I would click Next, and that would move through the process. It'll pull the solution files in. It'll install Power Platform Pipelines for me. So the install is very straightforward. The trickiest thing to do is identify that environment that you want to use to host this Power Platform Pipelines function. Once I do that, follow those steps, pull it into your environment. Pretty straightforward there.
So Doug, just to clarify, should the
Sure.
should this add-on go into a like dev environment or test environment, or a separate one altogether?
I would probably recommended best practice is to put it into a separate one altogether. I don't think it needs to be an environment that's exclusively for Power Platform pipelines. Like I said, I think if you have a governance environment or something like that, this is a logical function to pull into that. But it should not be in a developer's environment. It probably shouldn't be in a production environment. You probably want a specific environment identified for hosting your pipelines. Yeah. Okay, so like I said, in our tenant here, I have pipelines installed in our Center of Excellence environment. So this is where I have the full Center of Excellence toolkit installed. I use this to monitor, all of the artifacts that exist in our tenant. And we actually use this, more and more to manage everything that's going on in this collective GCC tenant that as technical specialists we all share and use. So in this environment, if I were to go to my list of apps now, since I've installed Power Platform Pipelines, I have a deployment pipeline configuration app. This is a model-driven app, and just like Center of Excellence, right? We're using our solutions to deliver features, or we're using our platform to deliver features of the platform, which I think is super cool personally. So same kind of story here. We have a model-driven app that architects everything that's going on within pipelines. It comes with a dashboard. It'll give me some insight into activity, pipeline deployments or pipelines that exist, deployment activity, which pipelines have been run, which stages of those pipelines have been run, et cetera. The steps to configure this are pretty straightforward. We have good documentation on this. I'm sure you can find it yourselves. We have links in the slides as well that we'll distribute. First thing I have to do is I have to set up my environments. So any environment that's going to be either a development environment or a target environment in our tenant, we need to set up those environments. When I'm creating a new environment, I'm going to give it a name. I'd probably just use the environment name here. I have to pick the environment type. This is important, right? Like I will only be able to execute a pipeline from a development environment. So where I'm doing my development, the environment that's going to be the source of all the artifacts that I want to deploy through a pipeline needs to be designated as a development environment. Any test environments, any production environment, if I have a training environment that I want to put some artifacts into an environment and use it for training, perhaps, any other kind of environment that I want solutions moving into will be a target environment, regardless of if it's a test or a production environment, et cetera. So I give it a name, I specify the type, and then I have to put the environment ID in here. The environment ID, if you're not aware, easiest place for me to get that at least is just from, again, the Power Platform Admin Center. You're looking for this environment ID. It's this GUID associated with an environment. You're going to drop that in here. Once I save this record, the pipelines app is going to validate this environment for me. It's going to confirm that it can find it and that it can successfully use this environment within a pipeline. So I get my environment set up, and then I want to configure a pipeline itself. And I'll just open this one up instead of walking through all the steps here, but I'll give it a name. I just find myself saying like, hey, I'm going to deploy to test and prod. Try to make the names meaningful by identifying the environments that are involved in this pipeline. I can give it a description, and then I have to link a development environment. I guess in theory, you could have multiple development environments all tied up in a single pipeline. For me, it's just, to keep my head straight, I was just kind of thinking about a one-to-one relationship here, right? So this is a pipeline that's going to move artifacts from my specific development environment to these other environments. So then I set up my deployment stages, which actually identify my target environments here. So my first step is going to be to deploy to test. And then my second step here is to deploy to prod. And before I can deploy to prod, there's a previous stage, which is deploy to test here. So this is kind of how we set up the sequential movement of these artifacts from a development environment to a test to quality assurance to production, or whatever your process looks like. I have a 3-step process here. You could have 4, 5, 6-step process, heaven forbid. However many steps make sense for you. Now, if I look at one of these steps, there's one more feature that I want to call to your attention here, which is this concept of a pre-deployment step and whether or not that's required. So in my pipeline that I've been using, when I deploy to prod, I want to have some kind of pre-deployment process in place. This gives me the opportunity to do a couple things. I've used it, and I will show you how this works. I've used it as an opportunity to put some kind of gating in place, specifically to put an approval process in place using Power Automate. We could use this to do integration with Azure DevOps and GitHub, right? Like if you wanted to kind of have a hybrid ALM process that uses pipelines, but also incorporates those ProDev, code repository tools. We could use Power Automate to start sending artifacts to ADO or GitHub or whatever, right? So we could use this concept to do a number of things. I think the mainline use case for this pre-deployment step is probably going to be some kind of approval and some kind of vetting process before a maker is allowed to deploy their solution into the target environment. So I have that turned on for deploying to prod, right? If I compare to the first step that I just ran, I had that turned off, right? So when I deployed that pipeline, it just automatically went and did what it needed to do, right? It exported my solution from my development environment and automatically moved it into my test environment. Since I have that pre-deployment option set up for the second step in my pipeline, let me get back to my development environment here. And I'm going to go back to that mini RMTS solution. This mini RMTS solution, when I go to my pipelines, I will see that it's been deployed to test. I can see the version when it was deployed. That was 16 minutes ago. The next step is to deploy to prod. And since I have that pre-step processing, whatever it's called, turned on for this step, I actually get a notice. Like as the maker that's provisioning or wants to run this pipeline, I get this notice that the deployment itself might be delayed because there's something that's going to happen here. So I'm going to go ahead and trigger that and deploy it here. Maybe. There we go. And I'll click next. It's doing the same thing, right? It's going through that solution checker. It's maybe going to prompt me to pick the connection that I want to use for my connection references. So it's doing the same kind of stuff that it did initially. This should be okay. Great. Next, and I'll deploy it. But what's going to happen here is because I have that pre-step processing checkbox configured in my pipeline itself, this is going to kick off a Power Automate that I've configured myself. And this is just a regular old Power Automate. There's a special kind of trigger. I can show you what that looks like if we have a couple minutes. But I have my Power Automate set up just to trigger some approvals. So I get this notice here as the maker that's executing this pipeline. My request to deploy here is pending, right? I had already packaged up the artifact. I did that originally. So we immediately went to whatever I told my Power Automate to do before it, quote unquote, approves this pipeline to execute into production. And so what I think I did is set up an approval that does some notification for teams. So here we go. I'm in Power Automate now. And I see that there is an approval request here. I've sent my approval request to Teams as an adaptive card, so I can approve right from my chat with Power Automate here. Seems like there's a pipeline deployment to prod that requires approval. That tells me who the maker is. Doug Bell has submitted a pipeline action that will move this specific solution. So I've included information about the details of the pipeline run itself. And then I have a link, right? So as an approver, if I wanted more detail about exactly what's going to happen in this pipeline management app, we're collecting a lot of data. We have a really solid audit log about all the steps, who's doing what when, exactly what artifacts are getting deployed, et cetera. So this is another benefit of using pipelines, is this audit trail, right? Like I wouldn't have this kind of history if I was just using a manual deployment process. So I can go to the details of this particular step. Maybe I want to check out the artifact itself. Show me more information about the solution itself that's getting installed. And so here we have memorialized is the actual zip file of the managed solution itself. If I wanted to open up that zip file and examine it for whatever reason, I could do so. So I have all this, I have this traceability, I have these audit logs, I have this history of everything that's happening. As the approver, I'm comfortable with that. I know Doug, I trust him, I know what he's working on. Yes, I know it's been tested, it's ready to go to production, it's part of our project plan. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this pipeline request. I can put comments in here if I wanted to. We can save those comments back to the pipeline management app, by the way, if I configured my Power Automate to do so. I have now approved this request. That'll go back to that approval, that Power Automate actually will now go back to the Power Apps Pipelines Management app itself and say, hey, this particular pipeline run has been approved. Go ahead and deploy that solution to production, and it'll go off and do its thing. So that might take a couple of minutes, but I'm just curious. I go back to, there we go. So now this has been updated, right? Previously, this was saying it was waiting for some kind of activity. Now it's deploying to production. So again, this pre-step processing is super handy potentially to put some kind of gating, to have an automated process with some kind of gating so I can empower my low code makers, right? That's the main population we're targeting here probably. I can empower my low code makers with this super convenient feature for deploying their solutions through a sound and governed ALM process. But as an administrator, I still have control. I can still have control over these pipelines. Again, it's not just my low code makers operating with complete freedom to do whatever they want. So we got a couple minutes left. I'll take the opportunity to show you a little bit about this Power Automate in case you're curious about that. Again, there's really good documentation on all of this. But to get to my Power Automate, the Power Automate is going to be set up in my host environment. So I'm going to go back to the environment where I've actually deployed my pipelines itself. That's my center of excellence environment. And I have it in a solution because I like to follow best practices here. I have a pipeline solution, and I'll go to my Power Automates. And I have a Cloudflow in here, right? So I'm going to edit this Cloudflow just to show you a little bit about how this configuration works. But this is pretty typical stuff, right? Again, like this is the beauty of using the platform to deliver automation and governance for the platform itself, right? I mean, tremendous synergy here. But the whole process is triggered when an action is performed, and we're using the Dataverse connector. And there are now actions. Once I installed pipelines into this environment, so if you go look for these actions in an environment where you haven't installed pipelines, you won't see them, right? So these new Dataverse actions that would allow me to do this pre-step processing here will get installed alongside the pipeline solution itself. Once you install the pipeline solution, you'll have access to these actions within Power Automate. So I'm basically triggering anytime a new deployment request is sent. And then I'm doing a couple things. What am I doing here? Oh, I want them to see. Oh, that was me testing, trying to figure out what all this dynamic content was, because when this request is triggered, like with most triggers, I'm getting dynamic content that I can use later on. So I'm going to create an approval, right? This is pretty typical Power Automate stuff. Approve or reject. Who's it going to get assigned to? I'm using outputs from the trigger. So these would be attributes about this specific deployment stage that's been requested. So that's how I was able to tell the approver that, Doug Bell submitted a pipeline to move this specific solution. We grab that dynamic content from the trigger itself. The dynamic content includes a link to all the detail about it. And then, I just put a step in here to send the notification to teams. This is entirely optional, right? I just like to do this. I like to be more proactive when I require an approval from someone. So I'm going to go ahead and post an adaptive card to teams. It's super easy to do that, by the way. Anytime you're using the Power Automate approvals, it'll actually automatically build an adaptive card for you that you can just send to teams there in a chat, put it in a channel, and then I'm going to wait for an approval. Once I get a response from that approval request, if the outcome is equal to approve, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to perform an unbound action, which is to set the deployment status to 20, which means go ahead and run the pipeline. Again, all the specifics of this are very well documented. Was not hard for me to figure this out. And then I need to tell it exactly which stage run it should go ahead and execute. And again, that input came from the trigger. I have not configured the unhappy path here, but there is a rejection code, right? I could do a similar step where I drop a status of 30, I think it is, drop a status 30 over here, and that would tell the pipeline management app that, well, this request was rejected, so go ahead and kill it. But I thought this was really cool, right? Like I thought this was a nice confluence of empowering our low-code makers with a very simple automated process with inherent checks and controls like the solution checker, the fact that it automatically creates a managed solution. So kind of the confluence of empowering that low-code maker within inherent governance restrictions and best practices, but also providing you all as administrators to put your own spin on it, create an approval process, do some additional automation. Maybe I want to take that zip file and I want to put it in a code repository somewhere. All of that is possible within the context of this Power Automate that will get triggered using that pre-step processing. So what do you think, Tim? Are you impressed? Are you going to try out pipelines now?
I'm sold, Doug. I'm so in. Great demo and great job. Fantastic work.
Cool. Thanks, man.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we have some wrap-up resources, Tim. I don't know, but I saw some chatter in the chat. I don't know if there's any questions we want to elevate